A bone-chilling morning in Colorado, a quiet street was suddenly torn apart by the pounding footsteps and sharp commands of a SWAT team. A small wooden door flew open with a cold, violent crash, and Orion Thatch Merriman, the reclusive man who had seemed harmless for years, turned around with panic in his eyes as red laser dots slid across the wall and locked onto his chest. In that moment, decades of buried secrets from Nebraska were about to be dragged into the light. Officers shouted in unison for him to surrender, weapons raised for anything, while Merriman stood frozen like a man just grabbed by the throat by his own past. As he was forced to the floor, the cold click of handcuffs locking shut echoed, a sound the families in Nebraska had waited nearly 3 decades to hear. But what made this arrest truly earth-shattering wasn't just the moment SWAT stormed in, it was why they were there: an old piece of cloth, a faded 1993 map, and a trail of overlooked clues that had finally led them to this man, the last remaining suspect in the mysterious disappearance of 12-year-old Juniper May Ellingson. As Merriman was led out of the house, head bowed low, the entire investigation team knew they weren't just taking a suspect into custody, they were pulling the truth back into the light. And before we dive deep into this entire breathless journey, from the afternoon Juniper vanished to the second SWAT burst into Merriman's home, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more shocking cases to come. Nebraska in the middle of summer 1993 always had a harsh, dry sun beating down on the low rooftops of the town of Kearney, making the afternoon air feel both quiet and heavy, as if everything had slowed down a beat. Along the road leading to the community pool, the green trees on both sides swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows falling across the weathered asphalt. In that familiar scene, Juniper May Ellingson, a 12-year-old girl small and quick on her feet, closed the door behind her and stepped into the late afternoon sunlight, carrying her swim bag, a neatly folded towel, and the familiar habit of walking that she kept every summer. The route from home to the pool wasn't long, just a few quiet blocks past neat lawns where people sometimes watered flowers or walked their dogs. Some neighbors in the area still remembered that moment in scattered but vivid fragments. Mr. Silas Arborgate was pulling weeds in his front yard when he saw Juniper walk past the gate, her high ponytail catching the last light of the day. A boy who lived at the end of the street, Finn Crowley, caught a glimpse of her from a distance while riding his bike home, and a few others simply recalled seeing a girl with a bright-colored canvas bag walking through the neighborhood like any other day. None of them noticed anything unusual, just the ordinary sight of a kid heading to the pool on a normal small-town afternoon. Time passed in silence. As the afternoon light faded, inside the Ellingson home, dinner was prepared as usual, but Juniper's seat remained empty. Claudia Ellingson kept glancing out the window, hoping to hear familiar footsteps on the porch, while Reed Ellingson tried to reason that maybe she was staying longer with friends. But as darkness fell, waiting turned into restlessness. Juniper had never stayed out this late without letting them know. The family stepped outside and walked the route she usually took, calling Juniper's name as streetlights flickered on one by one. They knocked on every door in the neighborhood, asking the same neighbors who had seen her just hours earlier. But every answer was the same: they had seen Juniper walking toward the pool, never saw her come back, and no one had seen her after that. There was no sign she had turned a different way, or stopped at anyone's house. The road to the pool stayed strangely silent, as if her appearance that afternoon had been a fleeting moment that simply vanished into the hot summer air. Worry turned to fear as they walked nearly the entire neighborhood without finding a single trace. Darkness settled over the rooftops, and an uneasy feeling spread across the usually peaceful town. Claudia and Reed returned home only to realize they couldn't wait any longer. This was no longer just Juniper being late. It had been far too long for a normal trip to the pool. Finally, with a slight tremble in her voice from worry, Claudia picked up the phone and called the Kearney Police Department. The phone rang in the quiet duty room of the Kearney Police Department that evening, making Officer Renee Calloway sit bolt upright. She picked up and heard a trembling woman's voice on the other end, Claudia Ellingson, reporting that her 12-year-old daughter, Juniper May Ellingson, had walked to the pool that afternoon and hadn't come home. Calloway quickly asked for every necessary detail: description, clothing, time she left, intended destination, and wrote them down while clearly sensing the panic rising in Claudia's voice. Once it was confirmed that Juniper had been missing for hours, and the family had searched the entire neighborhood with no trace, Calloway marked the case missing juvenile, priority 1, and immediately notified the department. Minutes later, Detective Calder Holt, a seasoned investigator with years of experience in missing children cases, appeared in the duty room, took the report, and scanned it with intense focus. He didn't waste time asking Calloway questions. He simply said, "Deploy every patrol unit in the area. I'm heading to the scene now." At the Ellingson home, Holt stepped into a space heavy with the anxiety of a family that had waited too long. Claudia and Reed recounted everything. Juniper left late in the afternoon, with a light-colored swim bag, walking the familiar route to the community pool. That was the last they saw of her. Juniper was always punctual, and not coming home after dark was truly unusual. Holt wrote down every detail, then immediately directed the establishment of a primary search area around the house and the route to the pool. A map was spread out on the kitchen table. He marked every intersection, every large lawn, every stretch of road that branched into wooded areas, and spots hidden from streetlights. Within 10 minutes, patrol units were mobilized and split into teams. One group walked Magnolia Street, another headed toward the pool, others fanned out into the small alleys between rows of houses. Meanwhile, Holt began collecting statements from neighbors, the last people to see Juniper. Silas Arborgate remembered seeing her walk past his yard that afternoon, looking normal, no one following her. Young Finn Crawley added that he had heard a loud engine noise coming from the main road when he saw Juniper a short distance away. He couldn't identify the vehicle, but the sound was clear enough for Holt to note it. A few others in the neighborhood confirmed they had seen Juniper heading toward the pool, but no one saw her return. Her timeline cut off abruptly, creating a gap Holt couldn't ignore. Outside, the search teams began shining flashlights into every bush, calling Juniper's name through bullhorns, sweeping every lawn and shaded area along the road. Holt walked the same road Juniper had taken, trying to picture each of her steps in the afternoon light. Did she turn into a small path, by a wooden fence? Did she stop at a friend's house, or did something make her pause on a stretch of road no one noticed? But everything was empty. No dropped items, no signs of a struggle, no cries for help anyone heard. The road that afternoon had been unnaturally quiet, as if the girl's disappearance had happened in complete silence. When Holt returned to where the search teams were working, night had fully fallen. He watched the flashlights flickering between the bushes, and knew that even though the teams were working at full speed, every passing minute reduced the hope of finding Juniper safe. Still, Holt kept his voice calm, as he reassured the Ellingson family that they were doing everything possible. He went back to the map one more time, scanning every line, and wondering if he had missed a stretch of road, a little-known shortcut, a ditch behind the houses, or a small lane hidden by a fence. That night in Nebraska, as the whole town sank into worry, Calder Holt understood that this disappearance was unlike any he had ever handled. No clear signs, no trigger event, no direct evidence, but one thing was certain: Juniper May Ellingson had vanished on the very road considered safest for her, and to find out why, Holt needed to launch an investigation faster, deeper, and wider than any he had ever run. This was no longer about a kid coming home late. This was the beginning of a missing person case he knew would change the town for years to come. The search for Juniper stretched through the night, and continued even as light began returning to the Nebraska sky. At first light, Detective Calder Holt was already at the Magnolia Pine intersection, where search teams reported they would focus extra attention because it was a stretch Juniper had to pass if she was truly heading to the pool. Gone was the uncertainty of the night before this morning. Holt wanted to shift the search from an emergency operation to a systematic crime scene collection effort. The search teams fanned out, dividing the route into segments of a few dozen meters each. Small stakes marked the areas already checked, and every meter of ground was carefully examined under the early light. A gentle breeze made the morning dew on the grass tremble, but no one paid attention to the peaceful beauty. Their only concern was any trace of the 12-year-old girl who had vanished the previous afternoon. At the intersection about 4 blocks from the Ellingson home, an officer shouted, "There's something here you need to see." Holt hurried over. In the early sunlight, on the dirt right at the edge of the grass, a small object glinted, a pair of light blue plastic-framed glasses. Holt crouched down, brushed away the fine dust, and lifted them with gloved hands. No mistake. Reed Ellingson had mentioned the night before that Juniper's prescription glasses were something she never left the house without. Holt held the glasses and scanned the area again. The location was odd. Not in the middle of the road, not on the sidewalk, but right at the edge of the grass in a slightly depressed patch of ground, just a few steps from the intersection. If Juniper had dropped her glasses here, it opened many possibilities, but Holt didn't let himself jump ahead. He simply said, "Mark the area, seal the evidence." News of the glasses spread quickly among the search teams. Some hoped it meant Juniper was somewhere nearby, maybe lost, maybe hiding from rain, maybe injured from a fall, but Holt knew any item left behind had to be read carefully. He ordered a temporary 30-meter radius crime scene perimeter around the intersection, restricting foot traffic to avoid contamination. The evidence tech team, though not a full forensic unit, was quickly brought in to collect microscopic samples: soil, trampled grass, gravel, fibers, or anything near where the glasses were found. The ground there showed slight disturbance, but nothing definitive. It could have been from last night's rain or a footprint. No one was sure. Samples were carefully placed into numbered plastic bags. Holt ordered them to collect even the tiniest things that might normally be overlooked: broken leaves, soil of a different color, a few twisted blades of grass. Everything was documented because in cases like this, sometimes the smallest sample can lead to a breakthrough. As the samples were gathered, Holt continued interviewing witnesses who lived near the intersection. Mrs. Marcy Woods, from the house across the street, said she only saw a few cars pass around 6 p.m. the previous day, but didn't recall any child. The man in the corner house insisted he saw a dark-colored pickup truck driving slowly through the intersection about an hour later. A young man working the evening shift said he had noticed the glasses lying there since last night, but wasn't sure of the exact time. Someone else said they walked past that stretch in the afternoon and saw nothing unusual. Another person recalled maybe seeing 2 teenagers riding bikes through the area quite late. The statements didn't line up. Holt wrote down every word, every time marker, and the more he wrote, the more the timeline around the glasses became unreadable. When had the glasses appeared there? Before sunset, after dark, or had someone simply remembered the time wrong? No two accounts matched. The more people talked, the more fragmented the timeline became. Holt stood in the middle of the intersection, eyes fixed on the wooden stake marking where the glasses were found. He tried to picture it. If this was where Juniper dropped her glasses, what made her stop? Did she trip? Was she called over? Was she grabbed? But there were no clear signs of a struggle. No heavily scuffed grass. No deep skid marks. Nothing else left behind. Just the glasses. A small item she would never forget to wear. The canvass continued, but Holt felt the gap around how the glasses ended up there was like a story missing both its beginning and end. Every statement seemed plausible, yet contradicted the others. and among countless possibilities, Holt knew he couldn't conclude anything yet. This was only the first piece of evidence that raised questions, but answered nothing. As the search teams kept sweeping a wider area, Holt stepped back and looked at the intersection once more. This was the first place Juniper had left a trace, but it wasn't an answer. It was the first question mark signaling that her disappearance was already more complicated than he had feared the day before. The glasses could say many things, but right now, they only deepened the mystery. Juniper's glasses were taken to the Kearney Police Department's technical room that same morning. By the time Holt returned to headquarters, the local forensics team had already begun the initial examination under the harsh white glow of fluorescent lights. Though they lacked the state-of-the-art lab of a big city, the techs still followed strict processing protocol, overall photographs, detailed documentation of the recovery location, then methodical inspection of the frames, lenses, hinges, and every possible surface. Holt stood behind the observation glass as technician Nora Halden carefully rotated the glasses under the microscope. She reported 2 fresh scratches on the outer edge of the right frame. "That doesn't match where we found them," Nora observed. "If the glasses had simply fallen at the grassy edge, you'd expect scratches on the front or the side that hit the ground first. These 2 marks are horizontal friction scratches, like they were dragged or scraped across a hard surface before coming to rest." Holt jotted that down. Anything proving the glasses had not fallen at the Magnolia Pine intersection could shift the entire investigation. When Nora flipped the frame upward, she discovered a thin layer of soil clinging to the hinge area. Reddish-brown dirt mixed with fine sand, completely different from the gray rocky soil typical of the residential intersection. Nora placed a control sample from the recovery site next to the soil on the glasses. Even with the naked eye, the difference was obvious. Holt stepped closer. "This soil doesn't belong where the glasses were found," Nora concluded. "The sample on the glasses has a much higher sand content. The Magnolia neighborhood doesn't have soil like this. You see it near bodies of water or areas with natural erosion." Holt's mind immediately went to places like the lakefront lots, the hillside trails, the sandy clay patches where the town's kids liked to play. Before he could say it, Nora continued, "One more thing. The left lens has a streak of plant pollen. I'll send it for full analysis, but this type is common in low shrub areas, especially the kind that grows near the ecological park." That single sentence lit up one location in Holt's head: Cotton Mill Park. Cotton Mill Park sat a few blocks west of the Ellingson house, lake, small woods and sandy dirt trails. More importantly, the soil there was naturally reddish-brown, almost identical to what was on Juniper's glasses. For years it had been the town's picnic spot, but Holt also knew it had plenty of secluded corners, little used paths, and exactly the sand-mixed clay terrain that had just been described. Nora kept comparing the control soil from the intersection: gray dirt, small rocks and gravel typical of Magnolia Pine. It only reinforced the conclusion that the glasses had been placed, tossed or dropped after being moved. No heavy foot scuff marks, no bent frames, no dirt pattern consistent with a direct fall. Everything pointed to the discovery site not being where the glasses first left Juniper's face. Holt tapped the table as he listened. Every new detail opened fresh gaps. Horizontal scratches inconsistent with the discovery location. Soil on the glasses mismatched to the residential area. Plant pollen consistent with low shrub zones. Zero additional evidence at the Magnolia Pine intersection. Put together, Holt knew the search radius had to expand, not just from home to the pool, but westward, where Cotton Mill Park stretched through wood sandy clearings and a little-known access path. Holt requested a detailed topographic map of the Cotton Mill area. On it he immediately circled the reddish-brown soil zone, the northern lakeside trail. It was the same spot local kids sometimes ducked into for adventure despite warnings not to go alone. A chill ran down Holt's spine as he studied the map. Juniper's route to the pool did not pass through Cotton Mill Park. If her glasses carried soil from there, it meant Juniper had either been taken there, or had gone there under circumstances no one knew about. Holt refused to jump to conclusions, But he also knew evidence didn't lie, only people did, or made mistakes. And the glasses were saying part of Juniper's journey had not happened on Magnolia. Nora moved the glasses under ultraviolet light for further checks. No blood, no unusual fibers, no clear fingerprints, but the reddish soil and plant pollen glowed brighter under UV, as if underscoring that the glasses had once rested somewhere with low vegetation and distinctly different sandy soil. Holt stepped out of the tech room, eyes still on the cotton mill map in his hand. The glasses, the only piece of evidence they had right now, were pulling the entire investigation in a new direction. And even though he didn't yet have proof of anything, Holt understood that the next answers lay back at Cotton Mill Park, where reddish-brown soil and plant pollen did not belong anywhere in the residential neighborhood. Those glasses were not just something dropped, they were the first sign that Juniper's disappearance had not happened entirely along the route everyone assumed. And Cotton Mill Park, silent beneath its rustling trees, had suddenly become the place Holt knew he had to focus on first. The moment initial analysis showed Juniper's glasses most likely did not fall at the Magnolia Pine intersection, Detective Calder Holt ordered the search expanded to Cotton Mill Park. He knew time was against them, and any delay could let traces fade in the Nebraska summer breeze. That same morning, as the sun cleared the treetops, Holt was already standing at the park entrance, surveying the sprawling half-open, half-secret landscape ahead, lake, reddish-brown dirt trails, and exactly the low shrub areas the lens pollen suggested. Search teams were divided again. One group swept the northern trails where red dirt regularly mixed with fine sand. Another checked the open clearings along the lake shore. A third was assigned the drivable perimeter roads. Holt repeated the order: any disturbance, turned soil, tire tracks, scraps of fabric, had to be flagged and preserved. It didn't take long before an officer radioed, "Got something odd on the north trail. You should come see." Holt hurried along the path where pale red dirt lay in patches under the sun. When he arrived, he saw two parallel depressions running more than 6 meters, clearly tire tracks pressed into ground still soft from the previous night. Deep treads, not especially wide, most likely a mid-size pickup or SUV. Holt crouched to examine every section. The tracks weren't perfectly straight. In places they veered slightly, as if the driver had paused or adjusted angle. More importantly, the churned soil was fresh, not yet blurred by wind or dew. That meant the vehicle had been here not long after Juniper vanished. Right beside the tracks, Officer Dylan Hart pointed to a tiny glint. Something caught on this low branch. Holt stepped over and saw a dark green thread, thin, less than 3 centimeters long. It was snagged on the tip of the branch, as if torn off when something or someone brushed past quickly. Holt carefully tweezed it into an evidence bag. He made no immediate assumptions, but the detail caught his attention. Juniper had been wearing light colors. This thread could belong to a bag, a vehicle interior, or whoever had moved through the area. At the edge of the trail was another mark, an arc-shaped scrape in the dirt, as if something had been dragged or pivoted there. No object remained, but the mark didn't match animal or foot traffic. Holt ordered photographs and soil samples from the spot, knowing full analysis would come later. Holt stood, eyes following the tire tracks as they continued outward. The twin ruts formed a straight line away from the soft soil, and toward a narrow exit that connected to a secondary road heading west. The final destination of the tracks was an infrequently used service trail, mainly fishermen or maintenance workers. It led out of Cotton Mill Park, away from the residential area, and toward open land stretching to the edge of town. The tracks grew shallower on harder ground, then vanished entirely onto gravel. Still, one detail Holt noted immediately: the vehicle had left Cotton Mill in the opposite direction from the Ellingson house, suggesting purposeful movement, not someone who had simply taken a wrong turn. Search teams pushed deeper into the small northern woods, where sunlight barely reached. Meanwhile, Holt stood in the middle of the trail and compiled everything they had. Juniper's glasses carried reddish-brown soil and plant pollen matching Cotton Mill Park. Horizontal scratches, most likely sustained somewhere else before appearing at Magnolia Pine. Cotton mill soil and vegetation matched the samples on the glasses. Tire tracks on the North Trail, in the exact soil zone. Dark green thread snagged on a low branch, possibly torn off during rapid movement. Arc-shaped drag scrape mark, suggesting unusual motion, not pedestrian. Tire tracks exiting the park in a direction away from the pool route. All of it pointed to one critical conclusion. Juniper had been brought to Cotton Mill Park, or passed through it in a way no one knew about, and afterward a vehicle had left the area that night. Holt stood still for a moment, listening to the wind threading through the trees and the distant footsteps of the search teams. He didn't yet have enough for a firm theory, but the traces found this morning confirmed one thing. The disappearance had not happened entirely along Magnolia. The girl hadn't simply vanished at the intersection. Her path had been diverted, redirected, and pulled into an entirely different area. Cotton Mill Park was no longer just a possibility. It had become the center of the investigation, and Holt knew what they had uncovered this morning was only the first layer of something much deeper waiting beneath the park's red dirt. The tire tracks and green thread found at Cotton Mill Park made Detective Calder Holt realize the investigation had to shift immediately to identifying who had been in the area at the time. Juniper disappeared. Back at headquarters, Holt ordered records to compile a list of everyone who worked, lived, or regularly traveled around the park. Maintenance staff, road construction crews, drivers using the secondary routes, and anyone previously cited for disturbances in the park. Cotton Mill was wide open with no gate or monitoring, so anyone could come and go unnoticed. Holt divided the list into workable groups for rapid screening: park employees by shift, the road construction crew working west of the park, pickup and SUV drivers, known to use the back routes, and finally individuals with a history of minor incidents in the park. Holt knew the initial list would be huge, but the goal was to narrow it by cross-referencing time, route, and vehicle. The strongest lead right now was the witness description: a dark-colored pickup seen near the time Juniper vanished. No plate or exact make, but it was still a powerful filter. Not everyone on the list drove that type of vehicle. Holt had records pull every individual who owned or regularly used a dark pickup or SUV and had been near Cotton Mill in the past 2 weeks. First-round screening happened that same afternoon. Park maintenance staff had clear schedules. Most left the area before 4 p.m., and no one was present during the window in question. A few owned dark vehicles, but had confirmed alibis from work logs. That entire group was eliminated almost immediately. The road construction crew west of Cotton Mill was verified the same way. 2 owned dark pickups, but both were logged continuously on the job site with time-stamped footage. No one from that crew had left in the direction of Cotton Mill Park, so Holt dropped the whole group from primary suspicion. Next were the truck and pickup drivers using the secondary road. This was the hardest group to screen. Routes were irregular, and many just passed through. Holt visited gas stations near Cotton Mill and asked if anyone remembered a dark truck stopping the previous afternoon. A couple of clerks vaguely recalled one, but no one caught a plate. The station cameras were backlit at that hour and only captured blurry silhouettes. Still, a few names went onto a watch list. None, however, lined up perfectly with the disappearance timeline. Most had left the area too early, or hadn't passed Cotton Mill that day at all. Holt kept the group as not yet cleared, but no one rose to priority level. The final group was individuals previously cited for disturbances in the park. None had serious records, but Holt interviewed each anyway. 2 lived nearby and owned dark trucks, yet one was on the evening shift at a restaurant, and the other was home with friends. Both had witnesses. Their past behavior had been annoying, not criminal, and nothing tied them to the disappearance. Holt made notes but temporarily cleared both. By the end of the day, the initial suspect list had shrunk dramatically. Dozens of names were eliminated for mismatched timing, wrong vehicle, or solid alibis. Still, no remaining name stood out as an obvious primary suspect. Yet Holt didn't consider the screening useless. On the contrary, it reinforced what he had already concluded at Cotton Mill. The disappearance clearly involved a motor vehicle, and whoever drove it had been present exactly when Juniper vanished. Holt ended the day with a short but heavy note. This wasn't a lost child. This was forced transport by vehicle. In the darkness falling outside the window, Holt knew the next round of screening would focus not only on the identity of the dark truck's driver, but on the route he took, and where he brought Juniper after leaving Cotton Mill Park. Finding that vehicle and its owner would be the key to cracking the first layer of this case. Despite screening dozens of names, tracing numerous vehicles backward, and thoroughly searching all of Cotton Mill Park and the side roads, Detective Calder Holt could not move the investigation forward even 1 inch. There was no standout suspect, no one who was definitively at the right place at the right time with the right vehicle. The evidence at Cotton Mill Park, though significant, still only painted a fragmented picture. A vehicle had been there, there were signs of movement, signs of transfer, but nothing pinpointed that location as Juniper's final point. Worse, in the many days that followed, search teams expanded into forests, fields, lake shores, and farther-flung neighborhoods, yet they found no additional traces. No swim bag, no clothing, no personal items, no indication the girl had ever left Cotton Mill or returned near residential areas. Searches with tracking dogs yielded nothing. The scent trail ended at the soft patch of ground where tire tracks had been found, then vanished completely, as though Juniper and whoever took her had dissolved into thin air. 3 weeks passed, then 4, then months. Each day the investigation lost a little momentum, as every avenue hit a dead end. The Ellingson family was kept updated, but Holt himself had nothing new to report beyond the fact that no body had been found, no additional physical evidence, and no one capable of causing the disappearance had been identified. With a case that had no body, no clear crime scene, and no direct witnesses, every theory simply floated without anything solid to anchor it. The Kearney Police Department kept up some sporadic follow-up activity, but over time resources had to be redirected to other cases, ones with more concrete leads. A meeting was held late that fall in which command concluded that the disappearance of Juniper May Ellingson had no fresh trails to follow, and active investigation could not be maintained indefinitely in this state. All reports, evidence, and investigative logs were compiled into a thick file, given its own case number, and placed into the queue to be reopened only if new leads emerged. At that moment, Holt stood silently watching the box of files being sealed. He knew this was not a personal failure, but the inevitable outcome when data-poor cases hardened into ice. Yet for Holt, it still carried the feeling of something left painfully unfinished. The glasses, the tire tracks, the rerouted road, everything pointed to a story, but the story was missing its beginning and its end. He still thought of Juniper whenever he drove past Cotton Mill Park, still pulled out the Magnolia route map some quiet evenings, hoping to spot something he had missed. But that hope was slowly worn away by time. Ultimately the file was officially labeled, Cold Case, Missing Juvenile Juniper May Ellingson. No more search teams, no more expanded area sweeps, no more continuously updated suspect lists, only an unsolved disappearance remained. In the years that followed, the file was occasionally pulled when tips came in from the public or when police received statements of uncertain origin. But everything led to the same place: no new evidence, no body, no reappearance of any item ever linked to Juniper. The case sank into the silence of time. From an urgent, hopeful search operation at the start, to a sprawling investigation, it finally became a file that grew thinner with each passing year, leaving only yellowing pages and the lingering ache of an unanswered question. And throughout those years, no one knew that the Juniper Ellingson case had merely gone dormant, waiting for something no one back then could have foreseen. A tiny clue, many years later, that would shatter that silence and pull the entire case onto a brand new path. Nearly 7 years after Juniper vanished, the case file still sat untouched in the cold case storage cabinet, like a sad memory of the town of Kearney. It wasn't until early 2000, when the Nebraska State Patrol launched a program to review long unsolved missing juvenile cases, that Juniper's file was pulled back onto a desk. Holt, though he had moved on to other investigations, was called in to assist because he still knew every tiny detail from the early days. When he opened the old box, he felt the dust of time on the reports, but he also saw fresh opportunity. Tire track analysis technology had advanced dramatically since the 1990s. The case's scant physical evidence, the photographs of the tire tracks found years earlier, was sent to the state's new forensic technical lab. In 1993, those tracks had only been documented with manual measurements. Comparison capabilities were extremely limited. By 2000, digital technology and geometric matching software were in use, allowing precise measurement of size, tread depth, and tread pattern. In the lab, technicians used high-resolution scanners to digitize every photograph. Every groove, every curve, every spacing was re-measured meticulously by the software. Details that the naked eye had only vaguely perceived before were now rendered sharp and clear. Holt watched from behind the observation glass, feeling the old puzzle pieces being wiped clean to reveal details he had never been able to see. After hours of analysis, a preliminary report came back. The tracks matched the tread pattern used on Ford F-150 pickups from the late 1980s to early 1990s. This was information they simply could not have determined in 1993, when databases were incomplete and analytical tools were crude. The technician emphasized that the degree of pattern match, including groove width and contact layer structure, made it highly likely the tracks came from an older F-150, not an SUV or compact model. Holt felt a door crack open right in front of him. If they could identify the vehicle type, they could work backward through registration records from the area at that time. He asked the DMV Records Division to pull every Ford F-150 pickup registration within the 3 years prior to Juniper's disappearance. The list was long: vehicles owned by Kearney residents, vehicles registered in nearby towns, and vehicles that had once been registered but later sold or removed from the system. One anomaly stood out, however: a number of early 1993 F-150 registrations were marked update incomplete, meaning the vehicle had changed hands or been sold, but the paperwork had never been finalized. This created gaps in the data, leaving several trucks unaccounted for after they left the system. Holt flagged every vehicle with murky or incomplete records for further checking. The goal was not to immediately identify a perpetrator, but to narrow the pool of F-150s that could possibly have been in the area the day Juniper vanished. From an original list of dozens, Holt whittled it down to just a handful that needed deeper follow-up: trucks that had been registered but then disappeared from records before or shortly after the incident. Although there was still no direct evidence linking any vehicle to its driver, identifying the tire type had opened an investigative avenue Holt never had before. The tire tracks were no longer random marks in red dirt. They now belonged to a specific make and model, a specific group of owners, and a traceable circulation history. Yet even with these promising results, Holt knew it still wasn't enough to break the case. They had no new witnesses, no additional physical evidence, and no 1993 traffic camera footage to cross-reference. The analysis had merely narrowed the field, but the journey to recover every missing detail about Juniper remained long. Still, as he closed the technical report and looked at the short list of remaining vehicles, Holt knew the case, frozen solid for 7 years, finally had a small ray of light. For the first time in years they were no longer relying on hazy memory alone. They had a concrete, tangible lead to keep pursuing. Narrowing the list of older F-150 pickups in 2000 had opened a new direction, but it quickly hit another wall when no further data pinpointed which truck had been near Cotton Mill Park the day Juniper disappeared. The file went back into cold case storage, waiting for another opening. That opening finally came in the summer of 2005, when the records department began digitizing old reports to clear warehouse space. While sorting through a stack of 1993 documents, an archivist noticed a thin sheaf of papers clipped inside an unrelated report, a missing dog poster from a local resident. What caught his eye was not the poster itself but a small folded incident report tucked inside titled Patrol Observation, July 1993. Looking closer, he saw the report contained one critical detail. A patrol officer had observed a dark-colored pickup parked at the north entrance to Cotton Mill Park, late that afternoon, the exact day Juniper went missing. There was no license plate description, but the report noted several characteristics. The truck was parked in a rarely used spot, an open area with few trees and far from the main parking lot. The officer had driven past, assumed the driver was just resting or waiting for someone, and made no further notes. The report had been written casually, not flagged as unusual, and for some reason had been misfiled into the wrong folder before archiving. When this information reached the investigations office, Holt was called in almost immediately. The moment he read the first line of description, he felt a jolt run down his spine. This was the piece he had desperately needed in 1993, but never had indirect proof that a dark-colored truck really was at Cotton Mill Park on the exact day Juniper disappeared. Holt asked records to pull the narrowed 2000 F-150 list again. If the truck the patrol officer saw was an F-150, and it matched the tread pattern from the tire track analysis, they might finally identify one of the remaining vehicles on the list. Although the report did not specify make or model, a dark-colored pickup aligned perfectly with Finn Crawley's witness description and the tire track findings. Holt's next step was to cross-check timing. The misplaced report placed the truck there late that afternoon, very close to the time Juniper left home. When Holt laid that timestamp against the timeline built from witnesses, everything suddenly lined up in startling fashion. Juniper left home within a certain window, was last seen at the Magnolia Pine intersection, and minutes later, a dark pickup appeared at Cotton Mill Park, a location with no obvious reason for parking there at that hour. The 2000 DMV data was pulled again. Holt went through the remaining older F-150s, focusing on those marked update incomplete, or that had vanished from the system after 1993. A few stood out: previous owners who sold without completing paperwork, trucks reported as having lost registration records, or owners who moved without updating information. All of them needed re-examination because they could have been at Cotton Mill yet no longer appeared in official data. Holt contacted DMV for any surviving paper files, since the early 1990s system was not yet fully digital, and among the scattered documents, several registrations listed the vehicle color as dark blue-black, catching his attention. These were also trucks from the group that disappeared from the system shortly after 1993, creating the very gap Holt had always suspected. Still, Holt knew he could not yet conclude anything definitive. The misplaced report only proved a dark truck was in a suspicious location. It did not prove direct involvement in the disappearance. But what Holt saw more clearly than ever was that the seemingly disconnected clues were finally starting to link together. A dark-colored truck seen in a rarely visited area. It appeared the exact day Juniper went missing. Tire tracks at Cotton Mill matched older F-150 tires. Several older F-150s vanished from DMV records right after 1993. After more than a decade of deadlock, for the first time Holt felt the case was no longer completely frozen. A single thin misfiled report carried the weight of a missing link that had been absent for years. And that was enough for Holt to decide the case needed to be reopened and expanded once more. One truck, one mysterious vehicle now stood at the very center of the story, and he had to find it. Many years after the discovery of the missing report, the Juniper May Ellingson case once again sank into silence. Every effort to track down the dark-colored vehicle led to dead ends. The DMV data was too old and fragmented, and direct leads about Juniper had virtually dried up. But in 2020, when a statewide cold case review program was launched with a focus on applying new forensic evidence analysis technologies, Juniper's file was pulled from storage once more. This time, it landed with Lieutenant Mara Kincaid, an investigator renowned for her ability to unlock seemingly dead evidence using the latest forensic methods. Kincaid reviewed all remaining physical evidence and spotted one critical item: Juniper's swim bag, still preserved in cold storage, sealed since 1993, and never processed with modern technology. Back then, biological analysis techniques were far too limited to recover useful traces from fabric that had contacted multiple surfaces. Now, with the help of the MVAC micro-vacuum extraction system, a breakthrough suddenly felt realistic. MVAC is a technology that vacuums and collects tiny DNA traces from porous and difficult surfaces, traces that traditional swabbing or taping could never capture. For Kincaid, this was a rare chance to find something the 1990s simply couldn't. The swim bag was taken to a clean lab. Under the supervision of 2 technicians, each sealed nylon layer was carefully opened. The bag's surface had faded with time, but the folds and straps still retained their woven structure, enough to trap invisible touch evidence from whoever had handled it. Kincaid watched as a technician slowly passed the low-pressure MVAC nozzle over every inch of the bag until the entire surface was washed into the collection solution. The resulting liquid was concentrated and sent for DNA analysis. The hours of waiting were tense, but Kincaid barely left the lab. When the technician emerged with a look that mixed surprise and excitement, Kincaid knew something had happened. The preliminary report showed a trace amount of male DNA recovered from the bag's strap. It was not Reed Ellingson's DNA, nor that of any other male family member, all of whom had been sampled for comparison. This meant a man had directly handled Juniper's swim bag closely enough to leave a trace, however faint. Kincaid packaged the DNA sample and uploaded it to CODIS, the National DNA Database. The team waited in the tense silence. Typical of cold cases suddenly offered hope. Even a tiny spark could be enough to shatter a wall built over nearly 3 decades. The result came back: no match to any profile in CODIS. Kincaid was not discouraged. On the contrary, the result confirmed what she had suspected: the perpetrator had never been arrested for a serious crime or had his DNA entered into any criminal database. A common situation in older cases. With trace male DNA in hand, Kincaid knew the next step lay beyond traditional methods. Forensic technology had moved far ahead. She requested the sample be transferred to a specialized unit that could perform forensic genealogy, tracing family trees through DNA by identifying distant relatives in public genetic databases. It required multiple levels of approval, but Kincaid pushed hard. She argued that the trace DNA on a critical location like the strap was very likely the only remaining evidence from whoever had contact with Juniper in her final moments. Even though genetic genealogy could not immediately identify the perpetrator, it could narrow the list to people closely related to the DNA sample, a technique that had already cracked many seemingly impossible cases. Juniper's file was transferred to the genealogy unit at the end of 2020, marking a new turning point. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the case was not just reopened, it had entered a phase no one back then could have imagined. The days of searching for clues in grass, dirt, and tire tracks were over. Now the investigation would move into bloodlines, DNA, and genetic history, where the man who once touched Juniper's swim bag could no longer hide forever. When the male DNA sample recovered from Juniper's swim bag was sent to the genealogy unit, the case, for the first time in nearly 30 years, had a chance to move forward on a completely new investigative path. The analyst assigned was Dr. Ryland Crestwood, a forensic geneticist renowned for building family trees from the tiniest DNA samples, sometimes using only a tenth of what traditional analysis required. Crestwood began by breaking the sample into genotype segments that could be compared against public genealogy databases. Unlike CODIS, which only contains criminal profiles, these databases are largely filled by volunteers seeking their ancestry. That meant the perpetrator's own DNA didn't need to be in the system. Only a distant relative's sample was enough to start tracing. Crestwood uploaded the segments and ran the matches. After many hours and thousands of comparisons, the system produced a list of people with varying degrees of genetic similarity, mostly distant cousins across generations. Still, those matches allowed Crestwood to construct a preliminary family tree, identifying relatives along two separate branches, and then finding where the branches converged with shared genetic markers. Over days of narrowing, eliminating and following genealogical trails, Crestwood determined the DNA most likely belonged to a single family line. He combined data from 4 distant relative groups, pulling residency records and old documents from Nebraska and neighboring states. Through this process, the surname Thatch Merriman emerged as the family with the closest genetic match. Based on the degree of similarity, gender, estimated age, and demographic profile in 1993, the family tree ultimately narrowed to just 2 adult males in the entire lineage. One of them had died in a work accident in Utah in the late 1990s. The only remaining individual who fit every criterion was Orion Thatch Merriman, born 1967, who had lived in Nebraska for years before moving out of state. Holt was notified the moment Crestwood reached his conclusion. The name Orion Thatch Merriman had never appeared on any original suspect list, nor was he a known troublemaker or family acquaintance. Yet residency records showed Merriman had lived in an apartment less than 3 miles from Cotton Mill Park in the early 1990s. A fact that immediately caught Holt's attention, since Cotton Mill had been the original investigation's focal point, though no one had ever considered Merriman at the time. Holt ordered a full record search on Merriman around 1993. The files showed he held various odd jobs: truck co-driver, small engine repairman, seasonal work. Those jobs often involved using or being around mid-size pickup trucks, the very vehicle class that had matched earlier technical leads years before. Even more notable, Merriman's relocation records showed he left Nebraska in late summer 1994, just 1 year after Juniper vanished. Leaving the state didn't prove guilt, but Holt always noted when someone changed residence right after a sensitive time window. Holt continued verifying Merriman's 1993 movements, workplaces, addresses, old tax notes and paperwork. While nothing placed Merriman at Cotton Mill on the exact day Juniper disappeared, he was well within a reasonable geographic radius to have been there. Records showed he worked rotating morning and afternoon shifts, but 1990s paperwork didn't specify exact days or end times. For Holt, this was crucial. A man with an unclear schedule, living near Cotton Mill, belonging to the family that matched the trace DNA on the swim bag. All of it formed a constellation of factors they simply lacked the tools to see 3 decades earlier. As Holt spread the documents across his desk, he realized that even though no final conclusion could yet be drawn, the investigation was no longer lost in the 1993 fog. For the first time they had a name, not a guess, not a vague description, but a specific individual revealed through science. And that name was Orion Thatch Merriman. The moment Orion Thatch Merriman became the focus of Dr. Ryland Crestwood's genealogy report, Detective Calder Holt immediately requested confirmation of the man's current whereabouts. Administrative records showed Merriman had left Nebraska years ago, and now lived in a small northern Colorado town, working as a machinery repairman at a local shop. Although he had no significant criminal record, the fact that he had lived near Cotton Mill Park at the exact time of Juniper's disappearance convinced Holt that the next step was to obtain a direct DNA sample from Merriman for confirmation. Surveillance was set up discreetly. 2 Kearney PD investigators coordinated with local Colorado police to establish coverage around Merriman's home. They were not allowed direct contact without a warrant, since Merriman was not yet an official suspect in the legal system. Therefore, Holt ordered all actions to remain passive surveillance only, collecting discarded items, the standard method for obtaining DNA without alerting the subject. For several consecutive days, The team documented Merriman's routine: mornings at the repair shop, lunch usually at a small diner near the highway, home around 6 p.m. The man lived quietly, rarely socialized with neighbors, and appeared completely unaware anyone was watching. The opportunity came on a Tuesday morning. Merriman bought coffee from a roadside stand before work. As he got into his truck and drove off, two investigators approached the outdoor table he had just left. On the table was a paper cup with a moist lip print still visible. It was naturally discarded evidence in a public place, legally collectible without a warrant. The cup was sealed, placed in an evidence bag, and rushed back to the Nebraska lab under priority handling. Holt didn't tell the team how he felt, but he knew this moment could be the final turning point after 3 decades of pursuit. Results came back in just 36 hours. The report was unambiguous. DNA from the cup rim was an exact match to the trace DNA extracted from Juniper May Ellingson's swim bag. No discrepancies, no exceptions. The match probability was absolute, sufficient to confirm Merriman as the source of the DNA found on the victim's item. Holt read the report 3 times, each pass as cautious as if he feared it might vanish. But everything was clear. 30 years of mystery had narrowed to one man living peacefully in Colorado, unaware that history was about to knock. As soon as the match was confirmed, Holt prepared an arrest warrant application based on the evidence: DNA match, genealogical findings, residency timeline overlap, and access to the Cotton Mill Park area on the day Juniper disappeared. Buffalo County prosecutors reviewed the file and agreed the evidence exceeded the required threshold. That same afternoon, the arrest warrant for Orion Thatch Merriman was signed. Holt notified the Colorado surveillance team to tighten observation and prepare to assist local arrest units. For him, this was not a moment of relief. It felt like stepping into the final chapter of a story that had seemed endless. With the warrant now active, the pursuit of Merriman, the man who for 3 decades had been only an unnoticed shadow, officially began. The arrest warrant for Orion Thatch Merriman was signed less than an hour before the surveillance team in Colorado switched to action mode, and the pace of preparations accelerated noticeably. Days of surveillance had shown Merriman lived a quiet life with little interaction, but the absolute DNA match wiped out any assumption of safety. The local police department decided to bring in SWAT, not because Merriman had a history of violence, but because they weren't willing to gamble on the unpredictable risks of a case that had dragged on for 3 decades. Morning in the small Colorado suburb was as quiet as ever. Mist still clung to the rooftops, and the first light of day had only just touched the wooden fences. While it was still half dark, SWAT teams had already taken positions around Merriman's house in complete silence. Detectives from Kearney PD coordinated with them, observing the scene one last time before giving the signal to move in. A heavy knock echoed through the misty air. The demand to open the door was repeated 3 times, but there was no response from inside. SWAT breached the door in one decisive move, stormed the living room, and had Merriman subdued in seconds. He stood there half asleep, no resistance, just looking around with undisguised shock. While Merriman was cuffed and led outside, Holt directed the search team to begin work under the warrant signed simultaneously with the arrest. The small house didn't have much in it: a tidy living room, a kitchen with few items, everything giving off a sense of monotony. But Holt knew full well that cases frozen for decades rarely left clues in the most obvious places. The door to the storage room at the back of the house was the first thing that felt different. A large plastic bin sat at the bottom of a shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust, but clearly opened often. When the bin was pulled out, the search team saw a coil of pale nylon cord, the same type and size, vaguely described in the 1993 report when analysts examined the Cotton Mill Park area. The nylon strands were intact, not rotted, and were sealed immediately. Right next to it, stuck to the edge of the bin, was a dark blue fabric fiber, an almost perfect match for the fiber found years earlier in the soft soil near the trail at Cotton Mill. No one said anything, but everyone recognized the connection was too strong to be coincidence. The search team kept going through the room and found a low drawer containing a 1993 paper map of Kearney. The map was old, creases softened by time, with two faint pencil circles, one near the road leading to the community pool, and one near the entrance to Cotton Mill Park. No other notes, just those silent circles from 30 years ago. Holt examined the map with gloved hands, checking every fold. He didn't voice a conclusion, but in his mind, the timelines and locations lined up in a deeply troubling way. The garage search yielded a few more details. An old toolbox contained a loose length of nylon cord, made of the same material as the coil inside the house. Some mechanical tools showed signs of heavy outdoor use years earlier. Nothing in the garage was conclusive on its own, but each item added weight to the growing chain of evidence. Everything was documented, sealed, and loaded into the evidence transport van under strict protocol. Holt watched the evidence bags come out one after another: nylon cord, fabric fiber, the map, the tools, and felt clearly that they were standing in front of the first physical evidence that could be directly tied to the day Juniper disappeared. Merriman, escorted in silence to the patrol car, hadn't said a word. He kept his head down, face expressionless, asking nothing about what was happening and offering no protest. Holt stood by the car door for a few seconds, quietly taking it in, not waiting for Merriman to speak, but to burn the moment into memory, a case everyone thought would never be solved. Finally had real pieces touching the truth. They had evidence. They had the suspect, but it only opened a bigger question that Holt knew he would have to face in the hours ahead. After Merriman was transported to the local police station to await transfer to Nebraska, the first interview began that same afternoon. No clinking handcuffs, no shouting, just a small room, cold white lights, and Merriman sitting motionless on a metal chair, hands clasped, eyes constantly avoiding direct contact. Holt entered with a thick case file and several photographs placed face down on the table. From the very first questions, Merriman showed clear inconsistency. Asked where he lived in 1993, he said he didn't remember clearly, even though residency records showed he lived near Cotton Mill Park for years. Only after Holt provided specific details did Merriman reluctantly admit, "I guess I did live in that area, but just for a short time. In reality, it was nearly 3 years." When asked if he had ever met Juniper, Merriman initially denied it completely. But when Holt placed a small enlarged photo from the 1993 file in front of him, not to accuse, but to watch the reaction, Merriman changed his tune. "I might have seen the kid around the neighborhood. You see kids all the time." For the first time he acknowledged some overlap between them. Without rushing, Holt kept probing every crack. The interview moved slowly, but was tense as a drawn bowstring. When Holt mentioned the swim bag, Merriman crossed his arms, glanced away, and said, "I don't know anything about that bag." When Holt informed him his DNA was found on Juniper's belongings, Merriman shot back, "That's impossible, I never touched her stuff." Moments later though, he shifted. If something was there, it must have been because the kid was running around the complex, or someone carried things back and forth. The explanation was far too loose to hold. Holt didn't draw conclusions, just let the silences stretch, forcing Merriman to fill them. That was when more contradictions started slipping out. Merriman admitted he once drove an old pickup in 1993, but couldn't recall the make. When Holt mentioned the tire tread from an older Ford F-150, matched traces at the site where the fabric fiber was found, Merriman went quiet for a beat, then said only, "I don't think I owned that truck, or if I did, I don't remember it having anything to do with this." Answers always hovered, half denial, half admission, a defense from someone who knew the layers of information were steadily closing off escape routes. When Holt shifted to locations, Merriman visibly tensed. He repeatedly used phrases like "on the edge," "soft ground," "quiet spot," unconsciously, when describing places he used to go while living in Kearney. No one in the room had mentioned Cotton Mill Park, yet Merriman referred to the woods next to the lake, a phrase multiple 1993 witnesses had used to describe an area not far from Cotton Mill. Asked why he knew that area so well, Merriman only answered, "I went there just to get away from people." His voice trembled slightly, and Holt knew that unconsciously, Merriman had revealed he remembered Kearney's terrain far better than an innocent person would. By the end of the session, Merriman leaned more toward defensiveness than confrontation. He said he never wanted to hurt Juniper, then immediately corrected himself. I had nothing to do with the kid going missing." The shift in subject from never wanted to hurt to nothing to do with made Holt jot a note instantly. Just before wrapping up, Merriman said one sentence that made the entire interview room freeze for several seconds. "If you're going to look, don't waste time around the pool. It didn't happen anywhere near there." No one had mentioned the pool, no one had asked where it happened, and Merriman had just unintentionally suggested a different location was the real one. Holt didn't need to say more. The statement was contradictory enough, revealing enough, and suggestive enough to move them to the next step, a step Holt knew would change the entire course of the investigation. Merriman's unconscious hints during the interview, especially the statement that it didn't happen near the pool, became the starting point for a new search direction. Holt and the team immediately reopened the 1993 geological maps of Kearney and cross-referenced them with Merriman's vague references to soft ground on the edge, near woods and the lake. Matching the elements, the most likely area wasn't the central part of Cotton Mill Park, but the forested belt west of Cotton Mill Lake, where the terrain shifted seasonally and had been expanded with new trails in the early 1990s. A ground survey team was mobilized as soon as weather allowed. No one dared hope too much. 30 years was long enough to erase all surface traces. Still, experience told Holt the ground remembers. If Merriman had hinted at a quiet soft soil location, he might unconsciously be describing a place that still haunted him. The targeted zone covered a few hundred square meters between two abandoned old hiking trails. Technicians brought ground-penetrating radar, GPR, to the site, set up a scanning grid, and began checking section by section. The radar screens showed color waves of the subsurface structure. Most were uniform and natural, until a technician stopped at an irregular shape, a section of soil that had been disturbed, then compacted years earlier. He turned to Holt and pointed at the screen. This spot was dug up. Not by animals, not natural. Holt ordered the scan area widened. GPR images revealed a roughly 1.5-meter deep zone, with uneven edges, like a hastily dug and refilled pit. No tree roots penetrated that soil layer, meaning the hole was made at a time when vegetation hadn't yet regrown, perfectly matching the period when Juniper vanished. The area was sealed off. Forensic personnel began careful hand excavation, removing thin layers of soil to avoid damaging anything below. The earth was damp, the smell of moss and decay rose sharply in the still air. Just 2 hours in, one technician called out, "We've got something." A small bone fragment appeared in the soil, then more fragments, misaligned, suggesting an unceremonious burial position. The forensic team slowly widened the pit, revealing a nearly complete child skeleton. No one spoke for several minutes. Wind moved through the distant pines with a steady sound like the team's collective heavy breathing. Even though they were prepared, seeing little Juniper's remains, now just bones, still left everyone silent. The most critical finds, however, were the items near the remains. About half a meter from the jawbone, the team recovered a pale blue plastic swimsuit button, exactly the style worn by children in the 1990s. Nearby was a faded hair tie, the kind Claudia had described in the missing person report. Another item, a small piece of dark blue fabric, matched both the fiber recovered from Cotton Mill Park and the one found in Merriman's house. Everything was sealed as separate evidence and placed in specialized containers. Holt stood a few steps from the pit, watching each item lifted with care. Despite years on the job, facing the end of a child's life head-on always left a permanent mark. Excavation continued until late afternoon. Once all remains were collected, the forensic team transported them to the lab for analysis. Holt knew they would wait for DNA confirmation, but in his heart there was no doubt about the victim's identity. Lab results came back days later. The remains were a 100% DNA match to Juniper May Ellingson. Holt read the report, placed a hand on the edge of the desk, and closed his eyes for a few brief seconds. Not from surprise, but because after 30 years, they could finally bring Juniper home, in the only way still possible. The case was no longer a missing person investigation. It was now a fully established homicide, and everything Merriman had said, every contradiction he let slip, and every piece of evidence recovered, had led them to a point of no return. Now the truth had to be faced in all its rawness. In the days following the recovery of Juniper's remains, the entire Nebraska Forensic Department completed the most critical step, reconstructing the full sequence of events on that summer afternoon in 1993, based on physical evidence, Merriman's scattered statements, and geological data. When Holt reviewed the final report, every loose detail from the past 30 years fell into place for the first time, forming a single seamless logical chain. Experts determined that Juniper disappeared within the roughly 1-hour window between leaving home and the family, starting to look for her, a time frame consistent with an opportunistic abduction. Using her usual walking route and neighbor statements placing her at specific points, forensics pinpointed the last confirmed sighting, the intersection leading to the shortcut toward Cotton Mill Park. At the spot where her glasses were found, soil analysis showed they had not fallen there naturally, but were placed later. This supported the scenario that Juniper was approached elsewhere, and evidence was moved to mislead investigators. Tire tracks recovered at Cotton Mill Park matched the tread pattern of an older Ford F-150, the exact make and model Merriman drove in 1993, according to DMV records and his work reports from that period. The movement was reconstructed as follows. Merriman spotted Juniper walking alone on a quiet stretch of road, approached her in his pickup, most likely by stopping the truck, calling her over, or getting out to block her path. Nylon cord and dark green fabric fibers, found both in Merriman's home and at Cotton Mill Park, matched materials consistent with him using rope to restrain or bind her before placing her in the vehicle. There were no signs of prolonged dragging or struggle, indicating she was subdued quickly. Forensics then timed the drive from the intersection to the wooded area west of Cotton Mill Lake. On the lightly traveled 1993 roads, Merriman needed less than 10 minutes to reach the burial site. The soft terrain matched his subconscious statement about sunken ground few people visited and aligned perfectly with ground-penetrating radar showing a hand-dug grave. Time of death was estimated from the position of the remains and decomposition patterns. Juniper most likely died within 2 to 3 hours of disappearing, the exact window during which Merriman had no alibi. No evidence suggested a second person. Excavation revealed only one set of soil disturbance consistent with a single individual digging hastily. When combined with DNA matches on the swimsuit bag, fabric fibers, nylon cord, the marked 1993 Kearney map, tire tracks, body location, and Merriman's contradictory and revealing statements, forensics arrived at the only sequence that fit all evidence. Merriman deliberately approached Juniper, placed her in his vehicle, drove to the wooded area west of Cotton Mill, harmed her, dug a shallow grave, and left. The forensic report concluded that no alternative scenario accounted for the full body of evidence. There was no trace mark or data suggesting a second perpetrator. No other explanation could account for Merriman's DNA on the swimsuit bag, his clothing fibers at Cotton Mill Park, or a 1993 map, marked precisely at the two key locations in the crime. Everything converged on one conclusion: Orion Thatch Merriman was the sole perpetrator in the 1993 abduction and murder of Juniper May Ellingson. The completed forensic reconstruction quickly became the backbone of Orion Thatch Merriman's trial at Buffalo County Court. Given the case's severity and 30-year span, the proceedings drew intense attention from local and statewide media. Merriman was led into the courtroom in a plain prison jumpsuit, face tense yet still attempting composure. Prosecutors, however, knew that composure would be difficult to maintain against evidence meticulously pieced together over 3 decades. Lead prosecutor Marla Grayson opened with a concise overview: a 1993 disappearance, a trail of seemingly hopeless clues, and modern science that revived the entire case. She avoided emotional appeals or family tragedy, and focused strictly on logic, process, and the absolute alignment of evidence. She then laid out each piece like a complete investigative map for the jury. First came the DNA. Prosecutors presented test results from Juniper's swimsuit bag, traced DNA recovered using MVAC technology, placed side by side with DNA from a paper cup Merriman had discarded. The forensic analyst confirmed a perfect match. This was an unbreakable foundation, placing Merriman in direct contact with Juniper's belongings. Next were the items from Cotton Mill Park: dark green fabric fibers, nylon cord of the same material as a coil found in Merriman's home, and the 1993 Kearney map, marked precisely at the 2 critical locations. Experts explained how each item fit the larger picture: fibers on soft soil, cord used for restraint, map circles marking the approach point and disposal site. Individually none were conclusive, but together they formed a chain that allowed no other explanation. Finally, the body location. The GPR team detailed the anomalous soil disturbance and the recovery of remains matching Juniper's DNA. Prosecutors highlighted Merriman's contradictory statements, particularly his remark implying the crime did not happen at the pool area, as indirect confirmation that he knew the real location. The defense tried clinging to the smallest possible cracks. They argued DNA could have transferred indirectly, that fibers proved no timeline, and that a 1993 map might simply be an old keepsake from someone who once lived in Kearney. They also attacked the 30-year gap, claiming witness memories were unreliable and the natural scene had changed too much. Each argument was swiftly dismantled. Indirect transfer could not explain a perfect DNA match deep inside the swimsuit bag fabric layers. The fibers and cord shared rare material and color, and appeared in 3 places: Cotton Mill Park, the grave site, and Merriman's home. A 1993 map with hand-drawn circles at the exact reconstructed locations could not be coincidence. 30 years did not diminish the validity of DNA analysis, ground-penetrating radar, or DMV data comparison. Even the most cautious jurors struggled to find any reasonable hole in the prosecution's chain. The trial lasted several days. When deliberations began, the jury needed less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. When they returned, no one looked toward Merriman. They sat straight and solemn. The verdict was read clearly: Orion Thatch Merriman, guilty on all charges: first-degree kidnapping, first-degree murder of a minor, illegal concealment of a body. There was no outburst in the courtroom, only heavy silence, as if the final chapter of a case frozen for 30 years had at last been closed. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. The Juniper May Ellingson case was officially closed in the eyes of the law, though its ripples still lay ahead. The life sentence handed to Orion Thatch Merriman was not an absolute end, but the starting point for a wave of reactions that spread across Nebraska. Just weeks after the trial, the Nebraska State Patrol held a major press conference at its Lincoln headquarters to release a comprehensive report on the entire investigation from 1993 to the present. Prepared as a transparency document, it also served as a commitment to reform after a case that had languished far too long. In the opening remarks, the NSP representative candidly listed the initial failures, overlooking a 1993 patrol report of a dark-colored pickup, incomplete collection of soil and tire evidence at Cotton Mill Park, and the lack of long-term evidence storage protocols that rendered some early samples unusable. Veteran officers present understood this honesty was not about blaming the past generation, but about underscoring the importance of modern standardized procedures. The cold case unit then outlined improvements made over the past 2 decades: national standard evidence warehousing, routine use of GPR in long-term missing persons cases, adoption of trace DNA and genetic genealogy techniques, and scheduled reviews of old files rather than waiting for new leads. The Juniper May Ellingson case stood as the clearest proof that new technology and processes could correct the mistakes of the past. When the report was made public, the Kearney community responded in varied ways. For those who had lived in the Ellingson neighborhood since 1993, Merriman's conviction brought release, not only because justice had been served, but because they had carried the weight of that day for decades. Residents who remembered seeing Juniper on her way to the pool that afternoon said the truth finally emerging felt like closing an unfinished circle. There were also more complicated reactions. Some residents expressed pain at realizing the perpetrator had lived among them for years without anyone knowing. The fact that Merriman had done mechanical repairs for many local families created a new unease. How many had unknowingly interacted with a man tied to such a crime? Cotton Mill Park, once a summer picnic and family spot, now bears a small memorial plaque for Juniper. The city did not want to turn the area into a symbol of tragedy, yet could not let the past be forgotten. Each summer, residents quietly leave flowers at the plaque, a way of keeping the presence of a little girl who once vanished without a trace. A significant part of the community aftermath stemmed from an open question: was Merriman linked to any other disappearances in the region? The Nebraska State Patrol confirmed they were reviewing unsolved missing persons cases from 1990-1995 to see if any matched Merriman's residences or employment history. Preliminary reports noted 3 juvenile disappearances from that period had been reopened for comparison, though no direct evidence yet connected Merriman to them. Still, the proactive review offered some comfort. No one would be allowed to simply disappear among old files anymore. Every cold case would be examined through the lens of modern technology, exactly as they had done for Juniper. Kearney, a once quiet small town, now carries an additional layer of memory: a 30-year disappearance, the relentless effort of investigators, and the eventual delivery of justice. Residents say they do not want to live in fear, but they do want to remember, because memory is the reminder not to repeat the failures of the past. Above all, they want to believe that with the sentence Merriman received, the soul of Juniper May Ellingson has finally found a place to rest, no longer trapped in the silence and darkness of the past 30 years. The story of Juniper May Ellingson and the 1993 Nebraska case actually hits very close to everyday American life today. Quiet towns, kids walking to the community pool like Juniper, families who believe this neighborhood is safe, until one ordinary afternoon turns into a nightmare. Juniper vanishing on a familiar route, in broad daylight, reminds us that child safety issues don't only exist in dangerous big cities, but even in the most peaceful-seeming communities. The initial complacency of parents and neighbors, followed by regret over the lost golden first hours, is a very concrete lesson. When a child is unusually late, react fast, call, search, alert police early. Don't worry about overreacting. On the other hand, the story also shows that investigative systems are not always perfect. A patrol report about a dark pickup got lost. Tire tracks and nylon cord were initially undervalued, causing the case to stall for years. Yet the fact that the Nebraska State Patrol publicly admitted mistakes, reformed cold case procedures, and applied new technologies, like MVAC, CODIS, and genealogy, to recover trace DNA from Juniper's swimsuit bag, sends a positive message. We have the right to demand transparency, and we must also support funding and policy for forensic science and long-term investigative units. Finally, the figure of Merriman, a quiet man who fixed cars and had no obvious violent record, reminds us of the danger of judging people solely by their normal appearance. The lesson is not to live in fear, but to teach children how to recognize unusual situations. Never get into a stranger's car even if the person looks familiar. Establish check-in habits. share locations, and build vigilant yet connected communities where neighbors truly watch out for one another and speak up when something feels wrong. If you want to keep following cases that seemed lost to time, but were brought to light by justice and modern science like Juniper's story, please subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video, where we continue uncovering truths buried by time.